Welcome to our series on how the public sector and critical infrastructure leaders can better detect and respond to cyber threats by taking new approaches to security operations. As cybersecurity attacks continue to increase both in number and severity, staying current on the latest technology solutions and best operating practices have become increasingly essential. I'm Wyatt Kesh with Scoop News Group, and joining us to talk about that today and taking a holistic approach to cybersecurity are Christopher Fielder, Field Chief Technology Officer for Arctic Wolf Networks, and Mike Watson, Chief Information Security Officer for the Commonwealth of Virginia. Mike, I'd like to start with you. Thank you for joining us. In the vast landscape of security technology, where securing various digital environments is becoming increasingly complex, it would seem like the integration of telemetry data stands out as a critical factor. Can you discuss why you see that as being vital for organizations like yours to both harmonize the security information across endpoints and networks and cloud services, and how such a unified approach can bolster their defense mechanisms?
Absolutely. And I think, it's been really kind of interesting to see a lot of the landscape evolve with the way that cyber attacks are coming in and where all of them are originating from and targeting throughout, our environments, within the state and within public sector in general, right? We have this sort of unique scenario where we tend to be targets for our critical infrastructure and our components that kind of have to be up when everything else is down, right? That's kind of what I try to sell as the mantra of what government is in the IT space. And because of that, with the way that there are so many different entry points at this point into the environment, we have to figure out different ways to address that and prepare for that across the board. So one of the things that we've been dealing with is, as we see more and more attack surface areas become available, we have to figure out ways to integrate and understand what the impact is in the different types of technology we've got out there. So you have to tell the story all the way from start to finish. That means all the way from the user, right, who is interacting with your system, through the endpoints and the networks and the servers that it touches, and then where it even goes from there as we continue to sort of introduce more and more critical third-party services like software as a service components and other pieces that are out there. As we become more and more interconnected, that whole surface area has to be evaluated to be able to see what the whole picture is for what's going on in the environment. So it's really critical that we're able to have that visibility and understanding about what's happening, so that we can figure out how to respond when something inevitably bad happens.
And then, Christopher, can you talk a little about why you see, as enterprises need to harmonize their information across endpoints and networks and cloud services? Number one, why that's becoming more of a challenge, and number two, what you're seeing the enterprises doing to make headway against that challenge.
Yeah, so the reason it's so important is because, attackers are very rarely just utilizing one, one item in the environment that they're maybe landing on an endpoint saying, hey, we're going to grab data from this endpoint and then leave, and then that's all we're going to do. That's not the case anymore, right? So they are traversing the network. They are utilizing, the cloud resources. They're touching multiple endpoints, multiple devices, IoT devices, pretty much everything in your environment that's networked. And so we need to be able to see, what have they done? Where have they been? What all was involved, so that we can see the full extent of what was involved with that attack. That is very important. Where have they created those persistence mechanisms? Where have they created backdoors where they're able to get back in the future, so we can fully address that. And so it gives us higher fidelity alerting as well. We are going to see just a massive amount of alerts because there's no shortage of detections that are out there anymore. But those detections alone are not always great, right? A lot of them are just noise, unfortunately. But when we can tie them in and get a larger picture, then we have a better chance of understanding, okay, what is just noise and what is truly part of a sophisticated attack, because we also have limited people. We have limited, resources that can move on these things. And the last thing we want them to do is spend all of their time really fighting through just a stack of alerts and going, this is a false positive, this is a true positive. By having more context, more information, it allows our people to really hone in on those true attacks and resolve those situations early on.
Well, Mike, back to you. As we were discussing integrating data points from all these parts of the environment, it obviously makes sense to get kind of a singular digital footprint. But talk to us a little bit about, what are some of the most effective strategies or tools you're using now to try to actually achieve full visibility across all of those?
Yeah, and an environment like the size of Virginia, right? So we've got over 60 different agencies, lines of businesses that we have to support with a whole bunch of components that are critical, differently for each organization, right? Obviously, we've got folks like public safety, and we've got everything from museums, like you name it. We've got some sort of type of industry out there that's part of the state, which means that understanding how different events relate to each other can be pretty tricky, right? What is a big deal about a credit card transaction, in one organization may not be a showstopper in another organization, just because the scope and the magnitude of it are just going to be very different. So it's important that we both understand when we see these events, whether it like how we automate and respond to that, as well as what does that actually mean to the business overall. It's the only way that we're going to be able to prioritize, as Christopher kind of mentioned, the scope and scale of the data that we're ending up dealing with nowadays is so large that it's unrealistic that we're going to have any one person be able to sit there and see everything. It's got to be more integrated. It has to be more automated, just like the rest of our IT that we're trying to push, across the board, right? Automation and artificial intelligence is the name of the game, right? What we're trying to do to make things run more smoothly and get a better understanding of what's going on. So when we're looking at ways to strategize with security, which is holistic data, looking at every aspect, and as mentioned already, every step along the way, we need to be able to see that full picture and relate it back to the business so that we can make intelligent decisions and respond appropriately based off of what's going on, right? It is one thing to deal with, a significant security event at a museum than it is when dealing with it at a law enforcement organization, right? We have two very different missions that have very different impacts, and the only way to understand that is to be able to see what those business capabilities are at each organization.
Well, and Christopher, as Mike said, enterprises and organizations all have kind of different needs and missions and strategies. But at the end of the day, what are you seeing as the most effective strategies or tools to actually implement a full visibility picture, regardless of what tools or systems they're using?
Yeah, so it's understanding, what makes up your environment. That's the first thing. What are the different factors and areas of your environment, and then utilizing whatever tools you have available to get visibility into those different aspects. Break it down easily. Like your endpoints, you need an EDR tool, endpoint detection response, an endpoint protection platform, EPP, maybe next generation antivirus, something that's going to be able to get deep visibility into that endpoint. Then you need some sort of physical or virtual sensor to be able to identify the network traffic and what's flowing throughout the environment. Remember that every device in your environment is producing some sort of a log source. So a SIM or a SIM alternative that can ingest all those log sources, and you can utilize that as well. Your cloud resources. So you need to be able to have some sort of an integration or tool that you can deploy depending upon what type of cloud tools you're using, whether it's SaaS or infrastructure as a service, to get that visibility as well. And then tying that all back together. Now, this is what's super important because, yeah, you've got the individual components. Now you need some form of a platform or some sort of a, people are using terms like XDR now. There's a lot of terms for basically the same thing. A place where you can put all that information back together so that your people aren't running around to like 30 different consoles and trying to piece together what happened. So that single point where they can then, respond to it, identify what's going on, make plans, work together, that's really important. And then another important thing that we want to make sure that we have is, I hear a lot of people talking about AI now. AI is great. I highly encourage people to look at AI, AI is going to be kind of the way of the future. But what I don't want people to do is think AI is a replacement for people. By no means is that the case whatsoever. So develop a policy where you say, hey, we're going to invest in some AI, but we're going to do it from the lens of that AI is going to enhance our people. It's going to act as a tool, but by no means is ever going to replace them. So, a good strategy for your people as well. What can we do? What can we buy? What can we deploy that's going to make their job easier rather than just make it more difficult?
Some great points there. Well, moving from strategy maybe to practice, Mike, could you talk a little bit about what practices that you'd recommend, in particular, to consistently monitor and maintain compliance and some of the regulatory adherence that I know is important at the state level, and how that leads to a heightened security posture?
Yeah, so we have this interesting sort of dichotomy in security, right? We often say compliance itself isn't necessarily good security. It's all about full integrated practices tied to the whole process and not just one aspect. What I kind of like to say when we're talking about compliance is that it gives you a picture of whether you can know whether you have good security in place or not, right? Knowing that you've got your risk assessments and your business impact analysis and all of the right control baseline configuration items in place, all of that stuff that's sort of important and kind of the good cyber hygiene stuff that we know should be there, that's our measuring stick, right? Like that's how we tell whether the environment is going to operate correctly. Now we all recognize that just like our regular IT environment, my computer boots up 90% of the time, right? There's 10% where we're having a bad day. And it's the same thing in the compliance world. We know the compliance gives us an idea about what it is that we're marching towards. What it doesn't necessarily do is tell us how secure we are at any given point in time, or whether something is actually going on in the environment at any given point in time. So as we're looking at our mechanisms to respond and our ability to sort of address some of the cyber threats and external actions and internal insider threat stuff, we've got to make sure that we understand how it is that our organizations are targeting, performing, and leveraging compliance in the right way. There's a lot of good things about regulation that helps us make sure that we're not skimping on some of the areas that we need to, especially when we're talking about critical infrastructure and some of those components that are necessary for our country to run. We do a good job of at least understanding what some of those baselines are. I love to say, in general, we know what security is necessary in order to keep our system safe. Getting it done is the hard part, right? You can ask any practitioner and they generally know what the top 20, 30 things are in order to come into an environment and make sure that it's secure. It just is, there's so many assets and so much technology, it's really difficult to make sure that that's all in place. So having a good compliance framework and then a strong operational hand that ties into that framework is the only way to make sure that you're actually getting it done. And then of course, leveraging good monitoring to be able to see what it is that's happening in the environment so you can tell what your real point in time is versus what it is that you're trying to work towards.
And Christopher, anything you'd add to that?
No, I want to echo what he said, which is a comment that I absolutely love, which is being compliant is not secure, and being secure is not being compliant necessarily every time. They are two different things that we have to look at. I live in Virginia, also like Mike, and our state, we have to get our cars inspected every year. There's a safety inspection you have to go through. But when you go and get your car inspected, you're not guaranteeing that that car is going to be working for the next year and it's going to be in great shape. They're just checking 20 things and saying those things look to be okay. And the same thing, compliance is saying these are the bare minimums that we think you need to do to provide some level of security for your environment. But once you pass that compliance, that doesn't mean that something else isn't going to go wrong. So that's why it's important to have, kind of both worlds. You need to have your compliance individuals that are focused on their job, making sure you're not going to incur fines, that you are doing, the minimum to maintain compliance standards, make everyone happy. But then go beyond that. Use that as a starting point and then branch out and look at the things that aren't being looked at by compliance as well, and making sure that those are, in a good shape as well. So yeah, at some point I'd love to get t-shirts made up that just say compliance is not security.
I'm sure you'd have a lot of takers on that as well. Well, just to wrap up, I want to pivot on something that you said, Mike, too, about the operations component. So can you discuss how, organizations like yours can develop robust security operations centers to mitigate cyber threats? And what final recommendations would you have to kind of proactively improve their security posture?
Sure thing. I think, one of the biggest things I try to tell people as they're working and building out their security operations centers or their threat management, structures is to say, first of all, this is a team sport, right? There is no way that any one person is going to understand everything that's going on out in the cyber world. It's not possible, right? We have to be in this together, which means, reaching out to wonderful partners, talking to folks. I have not yet run into somebody that says, "That's great, Mike. That's a great problem. Good luck on that." It's always, "Hey, what can I do to help? How can I, lean in and give some support to whatever it is that you're trying to do?" Because we are all in this together. So it's really important as we're looking at this and developing our operation centers and our operation protocols is to think about how is it that we can both pull information, understand what's going on out in the general cyber world, as well as give back to it at the same time, right? It's got to go both ways. As much as, I'm always a big fan of pass it on. If someone's helping me, I can turn around and do something, to help somebody else, even if it's a small thing. And we try to do that as much as we can, especially in public sector, wherever is possible. The other part I think that's really important for the cyber operations centers is, it does take some level of discipline and connection with others as you're trying to figure out, what types of things are going to be a threat for your organization, what types of things that you need to worry about. Those threat intelligence partners and folks that you've got to make connections to are just as important, just so that you know what's out there. As much as I think I've got a good plug-in to what's happening in the world, I'm sure that there are 15 other things that happened just this weekend that I wasn't aware of that I probably should be, turning grayer over. But I think that's the biggest thing I'll say is make sure that you've got your team together, make sure that you're making those connections. There's a lot of wonderful partners out there to help with the actual operations and turning the wrenches of implementation for these security operations centers. Lean on them, talk to them, especially when you're resource strapped. It's important that we work together in this, and I think that's one of the nicer opportunities out there to try to make that happen.
Absolutely. And Christopher, your kind of final thoughts and recommendations on how to bolster the operations side of security.
Sure. Once again, it goes back to the heart, I believe, of operations is going to be people. And I know that's not an easy thing to do, right? We did a research report recently, about a year ago, where we talked to 700 security leaders worldwide. And of those 700 security leaders, 42% of them were trying to hire 10 or more cybersecurity
Wow.
people. There's just not enough people to go around, but that doesn't mean that you need to go without. There are services that are out there, there's consulting, there's ways that you can find people that can really help you out. So don't go without just because you're having a hard time getting full-time employees. Look for alternative routes as well, because the people are really going to be the heart of what's going to help you. And the last thing I'll say with that too is, unfortunately, we're in a position right now because there is kind of this cybersecurity skill shortage where some vendors are trying to say, "Hey, we can sell you a tool or whatever it is that makes it so you don't have to have people." Let's just be honest, we're not at that point yet, right? So I have yet to see it. There are tools out there that can certainly help your people. There's certainly tools that can prevent burnout and kind of maybe even minimize the amount of people you have to have. I'm not going to lie, say that's not realistic, but to fully replace your people, I don't think we're anywhere close to that by any means, and it's just going to cause more damage than good. So, just be cautious when you hear those type of pitches. Take the free T-shirt, take the free lunch, but don't actually, invest in that tool yet. So, I'll just leave it with that.
Well, absolutely. And I'm afraid we will have to leave it at that. So Christopher Fielder and Mike Watson, thank you both very much for joining us, sharing your respective insights on just the operational dynamics of improving security, both at the public sector and enterprises at large. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.